Hello and happy Samhain. Welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched, where on this episode, in honor of the spooky season, I decided to watch Ready or Not, which is billed as a comedy horror film, though I have some thoughts about that I'll get into. Um, this is a fairly low budget film. In fact, I think the listed budget is $6 million. So it's on the low end, and it's definitely in some ways in keeping with the trend that I've spoken of previously during the Scream episode, of the idea of low budget horror being popular these days. Um, this film was reasonably successful. I think it turned like 10 times its budget, so, pretty good. Uh, and just right off the bat, I think I would say it's a worthwhile watch. Um, but that comes with some caveats. So, this is interesting that it's called a comedy horror. I'm not sure I would quite agree with that. Uh, I don't, of course, as usual, I'm going to try and avoid talking about the plot too much. But it's hard to, I wouldn't really consider this a horror film. I would definitely push it much more towards the thriller end of that spectrum. Thriller with, a bit of violence and gore. And I think often films are mistakenly classified as horror because they have those two things when in reality they're something else. I would agree with the comedy part of it mostly. But when we get to talking about the plot and the story, I'll talk about that a little bit more. So this is like I said, fairly low budget. Not a lot of big names attached to this, but some notable names and people you may have seen before. I think probably the quote unquote biggest name might have been Andie MacDowell, although frankly, I haven't seen her in anything in 15 years. I don't know what she's been up to, but yeah, she's probably the most notable name. But the main character is played by Samara Weaving, who is a fairly new actor in Hollywood, I would say. Has been in a few productions of greater note more recently, but yeah, she does a pretty good job. I'll just say that. I was generally quite pleased with the casting and the acting in the film. It's always a fine line to walk when you have a comedy mixed with anything else. In fact, I would say generally speaking, most comedy films have just awful acting in them. So being able to balance both, a more balance the understanding that you are in a thriller plot while still delivering lines in a way that is properly read as comedic is can be difficult, I think. And so on all counts, all of the characters in the film do an admirable job. There's a number of other characters who played by actors you may have seen before, but I don't have the list in front of me. So I feel like I need to talk about the production a little bit, and I actually discovered something after the fact as I was looking up some notes about this. So this is fairly low budget, and it's directed by two people and produced by a third who collectively have a bit of a history together. The company's name, I think, is Radio Silence Productions. They have a couple of other horror films under their belt prior to this. Also quite low budget, nothing of particular note. Don't have the list in front of me. But you can look it up. And I thought what was notable about that as well is they are also attached to a Scream sequel that is coming out in 2022. So, yeah, whether or not that is a cursed property at this point or not is another question. But this performed well enough, obviously, that they were given the helm of another film. The three of them, two of them directors, one as a producer, they didn't write the film. The film was written by two other folks. And there's some structural, I hesitate to say problems in the film, but there's some things that make me wonder how much was the script, how much was the direction, and what may have been cut or added during the rewrites in production. But I'll get to that in a moment. I want to talk about the cinematography a little bit because it definitely there's some beautiful stuff in this film. Well, beautiful might be a little bit strong. Let me step back once more and talk about the connection. There is an interesting connection in my mind between this and Knives Out. It's a similar sort of thing where both for budgetary and, simplicity sake, they've limited the scope of the film to basically, more or less one location. And I think it works very well. The house that I actually don't know whether this is it was sets or not. I would think that it's possibly not sets and it's an actual house, but I didn't check that. The house that the film primarily takes place in is it's a wonderful house. Lots of neat details, and you get a lot of information from the house itself. It's not as nicely dressed as the one in Knives Out, and it is not necessarily used to the utmost extent. I think there's a real missed opportunity to utilize the size and structure of the house to do more storytelling as well as have more dynamic and interesting scenes. But it's, reasonably low budget. If it's not an actual house and it's sets, then, if you have to build more sets or more connecting tissue to the house, that makes it more difficult and more expensive, of course. So possibly that wasn't a thing. But again, I'll get into my structural issues in a little bit. The cinematography is pretty hit and miss. There's some good stuff in there, but often it falls back to a lot of handheld, a lot of very low light, and what feels to me, I hesitate to use the phrase amateur or the word amateurish, but it makes it feel a little bit low budget because it feels like the type of thing where they said, oh, we don't need to have lighting. We don't need to, add the lighting here, or we don't need to, do multiple shots of a multi-camera shoot of this scene so that we can get, reverse shots coming and going and those sorts of things. But I think that the cinematography in the film in general would have greatly benefited from a little bit more care taken there. And I have a particular pet peeve for, handheld work in general, but more specifically use of shaky cam, and just there's some messier bits that delve into the ugly. Likewise, some of the editing is quite good, and some of it is pretty poor. Lots of stuff where they do quick cuts in quick succession. The 2010s, 2020s type of like action scene cuts that I think detract from whatever they're applied to. So I was a little bit discouraged by that. Frankly, the whole thing as a thriller is a little bit odd because it swings between tones in multiple ways, scene to scene, and even shot to shot. Can seem a little disjointed, and how do I talk about this without talking about the plot? The movie seems to sometimes forget which tone it's going for. It will swing from a scene of shot, reverse shot in a room where all of the cameras are tripoded, and there's not a lot of camera movement, and they're using judicious use of zoom and things like that to do pretty good framing. And then in the thriller portions, it seems to devolve, and I don't necessarily want to blame that. I would blame that in part on a trend in filmmaking, but it is a little disappointing. Generally speaking, I was quite pleased with the writing itself. A lot of the dialogue is quite good. It doesn't shy away from being a little awkward on purpose. It doesn't shy away from use of profanity in a meaningful way. It's got characters with some level of nuance to them, and it's generally it keeps a pretty good tone, without expositing too much. It understands its scope pretty well and expects the viewer to be reasonably intelligent and understanding of what they're viewing. This does not, thankfully, succumb to the poor writing, mostly often in horror films, but in other genres as well, of explaining the things to the viewer that the viewer has already figured out, or should have already figured out if they were paying any attention at all. So pretty pleased on that front. The characters, like I said, are all reasonably nuanced, or as much as they can be in a film of this type and structure. Not as good as Knives Out. I can't. It's hard for me not to compare the two because there are a number of similarities, but they are also fundamentally different films. So you'll have to forgive me. And there's an interesting portion of it where I wasn't even sure going in what era it was set in. And I won't explain why. Well, I initially thought that this was set, before watching it, my very vague impression before picking it up to watch it was that this was set possibly in the 19th century. And it's not. It's modern, and it actually uses that to very good effect. It uses sorry, I'm falling all over my words trying not to talk about the plot. Anyway, so let's talk about the plot. Not the plot itself, but the structural problems that I see with it. The core problem is that it starts off very strong, and then it hits the second act, so to speak, and that's where it sort of loses what's good about the film. It's not bad. It's not terrible. It's not offensive. It's just no longer has the seeming like love and care taken. And it gets away from the sort of subversive comedy that I think was very well used, and more into horror tropes and thriller tropes, and uh, and yet it repeatedly subverts its own tropes and narrative, and it does so a little bit too aggressively, where every time you think you know how a scene's going to play out, and I do mean pretty much every time, it decides to take a turn. And structurally, that's a problem because you don't get well, as the viewer, there are many things that you don't get a satisfying payoff for. Now, I'm a big fan of subverting tropes and, doing unusual things that don't let the, don't let the viewer expect where the scene is going to go and be right all the time. But this does it so frequently that it just sort of undercuts the whole structure and leaves you somewhat unsatisfied for a substantial portion of the film, I would say. Like I said, I think this is more of a thriller than a horror film, but it certainly uses some of the beats of a horror film, in a thriller sort of way, where chases and action and threats are structured like horror but executed like thriller. That's not necessarily a good or bad thing. It's just, I think, worth noting that I was expecting more of a horror film, and this didn't quite go that direction. However, I will say it comes around towards the end, where it sort of returns to its original tone, its original structure. And at the end, I had had a couple more laughs again. And I don't know whether it's, I can't be disappointed that it returned to where I wanted it to be, but it doesn't excuse some of the problems in the middle. That much was a little bit disappointing. That said, all in all, it's definitely got some good stuff in it. I think it's worth a watch. Maybe not multiple times. It's not incredibly inventive. It's not incredibly subversive in a meaningful way. It's not particularly extraordinary, but what it does, it generally does pretty well. And it was an enjoyable watch at the beginning and at the end, and the middle is sort of There are a couple of plot beats that I don't particularly like. I'm not going to spoil anything here, but there is two moments in quick succession that are sort of, well, I don't particularly like personally, but also seem rather atonal, that devolve into like borderline what's referred to as torture porn. The like sort of gruesome for gruesome's sake. It's the only time in the film it really does that. And it's kind of bizarre. And I wish they had just cut it out, because it's not particularly meaningful to the plot and doesn't get a real payoff, other than sort of maybe hitting a beat for people who wanted a certain sort of thing coming from this movie. I wish they had just removed it entirely. But it's short enough and inconsequential enough that, I noted it, but it didn't ruin the film for me or anything like that. Anyway, um, yeah. So on the whole, pretty pleased with it. At this point in the video, I think I'm going to break and say spoilers from here on out. Because I do sort of want to talk about the plot and I want to get myself in the, like, I want to start talking about the plots at the end of the videos, and I need to do it at some point instead of continuing to tell myself I won't. So anyway. So I think the core failure of the plot is that it devolves into the hunt and the hunt alone. The middle section of the film, once the hunt starts, largely forgets why it seems to largely forget why the hunt is happening, and forgets about this interesting and amusing family that we're following. Like, yes, they are evil, sadistic weirdos, but they're also a amusing, dysfunctional family with, interactions between each other that all work really well in the first portion of the film. And then once it gets too much into the chase, basically after she's wounded for the first time, I guess, it just has the scene after scene of her being chased and trying to get away or trying to defend herself or trying to do these other things. And it doesn't really work that well because a lot of those scenes, as I mentioned before, don't really have a payoff, but also they adhere too much to the like final girl horror tropes where she can never quite get an upper hand. And I feel like if this had gone full comedy thriller and it had just sort of been a farce where the family is constantly trying to hunt her and maybe she gets injured or wounded at some point or another, you don't have to cut all that out. But having them repeatedly fail or screw up or not have planned something out or say, fuck it, well, we're throwing away the rules because who cares? That's the good part of the film. And instead, like, we have these extended scenes of her with sort of the final girl look on her face, the like, oh God, what's happening to me? Really, the moment that I knew this was going to go away, I didn't particularly like, was when she pulls the gun off the wall in the family room and then doesn't get to fire it. And it's a little on the nose to call this a failure of Chekhov's gun. But it literally is that. Where they literally, she's got a big gun. She's got this elephant gun. She's like gearing up. It's shot like she finally has the upper hand. And then 3 minutes later, she goes to use it and the whole thing's subverted. And it's just like, okay. Kind of a disappointment there. And if it had cut back to the family also screwing up in their reaction, if they had found the husband in the security room and then found her and then like been like, we got you now, and then they fail too, then that keeps the momentum. I don't necessarily need to have her succeed like dramatically and turn the tables. That would have been good in its own right, but there's other ways to not have her succeed completely but still keep the pace up, right? Where she gets away a little, they catch up a little, she gets away a little, they catch up a little, so on and so forth. Instead, you've got these sort of disjointed scenes where, like, actually I forgot, there's a third unnecessary scene of like torture porn where she's climbing through the fence. The ones I was thinking of were where she was shot through the hand, and then when she impales herself on the nail. It's just like, why does that scene exist other than to incorporate the kid and the, death pit, which is just kind of goofy. But when she climbs through the fence and you're like, oh, she's finally getting somewhere, and then immediately it's undercut. And she gets this big gash on her back, which they keep cutting to. They're like, look, she's hurting herself to get out. And I'm like, is that necessary? I mean, like, did it do anything? None of those three scenes really do anything other than like make her dirty and make her scream. Because like she loses use of her hand in following scenes a little bit, but she doesn't seem to be seriously traumatized by the experience or like continually having to deal with it like a fucking hole through your hand would, a quarter size hole through your hand would have the effect of. And the gash on her back also is like inconsequential, but they keep cutting to it as though it's like this is her last ditch effort and she's killing herself to get out or something like that. It's just sort of bizarre. And I wish they had cut all of that out and maybe even kept it incorporated to the property. Her leaving, of course, like everything else in those various chase scenes, is undercut immediately. Within 10 minutes, she's back on the property, and then she's captured, and then she's away again, and then she's captured. It's just, I feel like they could have. This isn't a particularly long film, and they don't need to shorten it, but those scenes could have been tightened up or made more meaningful. And it's just a little disappointing to see that not used. Likewise, as I was talking about at the beginning, but didn't really get into too much, the house itself, they set up right at the beginning, oh, there's these servants' tunnels and things like that. And that's a great opportunity to remind you that not only that there are servants' tunnels, but this is an old house with lots of secrets and multiple floors and all these things, and it's not used at all except to let the husband guy out of the room once, I think, and then they escape down at once, and then it's never done again. The whole house is not used very effectively. It's a good set piece, but they mostly just stand in the rooms. And I would have liked to see. I think the only shots that actually use the house at all are right at the beginning where she's starting to hide. She goes up the stairs. They follow her down this long hallway. She gets into the dumbwaiter, and then it's never used again. Like, there's no in and out of hallways. There's no in and out of doors. There's no in and out of rooms. There's no up and down stairs. It really seems like a squandered opportunity to me. Instead, they go outside because, I don't know. Frankly, I think this movie could have been longer, but they still could have made it tighter with more meaningful use of, the chase and the hiding and all these things. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm not going to edit this. I was thinking about no, I'm not going to edit this because I already didn't say jump to this time code to see the end. Anyway, I'll fix that next time I do this. I'm still getting the structure of this thing down. Anyway, on the whole, if you watch this far, it either means you didn't watch because you didn't want to, or you did watch and came back. So I appreciate that either way. Interesting film. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I thought it was a worthwhile watch. I'm kind of curious what these guys will do with Scream, a Scream sequel. Having not watched the other Scream sequels, but knowing their reputation, I would hope it's not another shitty Scream sequel. And I feel like these guys have talent. I'd just like to see them tighten up the execution a little bit. I am curious how much of that, like how much of the chases and escapes and things were part of the writing, and how much of them were like a matter of direction, where they said, this is what we had the budget for, this is where we can go. You know, yeah. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode. I'm just sort of trailing off here. Let me know your thoughts, and I'll see you guys next time.